Today I'm speaking with Caroline Overington, journalist and author. Her most recent book is Sisters of Mercy. Welcome, Caroline. Your books often deal with topics that surround family issues, children who are vulnerable or have disabilities. Why is it that you feel compelled to write about these subjects?
So for me, it started with my journalism. I was a reporter for the national newspaper, The Australian, and my round was child welfare, which also incorporates child abuse and sadly also child murder. And so I did that round for about 2 years, and I think in the course of that time I was asked to look at the death of about 8 children. Some of those children were murdered by their parents, others by people who were meant to be caring for them, and in other cases they died of abuse or neglect. And it was my role as a reporter to try to illuminate some of the issues, because I think as a society we are concerned about the vulnerable amongst us, which means the elderly, women, and of course children. And so a lot of the time I would be looking at the stories, the death of the children, and I would feel that I couldn't tell the whole tale. When you're covering a real life murder, for example, there are things you can and can't say because of the judicial system. Sometimes there may be a case pending before the court and you can't prejudice the trial, things like that. So with the novels, what I've been able to do is tell what I believe are very real stories about children and other vulnerable people who live amongst us without getting myself into any trouble with the law.
Right. This story is a very particular story. It deals with a number of children who have disabilities who are in foster care. Is that based on a true story or a story that you were involved with?
Well, actually, this particular story started out, Sisters of Mercy started out with the idea, the number of people that I've met over the years as a reporter who either are in prison or released from prison or about to go to prison, who insist that they are innocent. And I know that it's an old joke that everybody in prison is innocent, but in fact, some people I think must be. And then of course there's the idea that people see their actions differently. So you may indeed have caused the death of a child, but you don't hold yourself responsible. I mean, that's a very difficult concept for some people to get their head around, but there are a number of people who can still say, I didn't mean it, or it wasn't meant to be that way, or I'm not responsible because of my own background, my own childhood, I was drunk, I was on drugs, or I was made to do it by whatever these other factors in my life are. And so I was intrigued by this idea of a character who everybody assumed was guilty, but who insisted upon her innocence. And that's why it takes the form of her writing letters to a reporter, trying to convince him that she's innocent of what she's done. But in terms of the children in the book, yes, of course, there are a number of children that I have come across in the community who have been at the mercy of their carers. And often their carers will be pretending to be doing the right thing by them, and that may not necessarily be the case. But really the other part of the story that I wanted to discuss was the idea that there are a number of parents, in fact hundreds of thousands of parents, who have severely disabled children who take care of them themselves and get very little assistance. And I suppose a lot of people in the community have been watching the debate about the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is designed to give you, if you're a mum and you have a child who's in a wheelchair, with a headrest and has to be intravenously fed, and you can't leave the house and you can't work and you can't leave them with anyone. At the moment there's no real assistance for you. They might be able to send someone to perhaps help you clean your house or whatever, but really there isn't much. And it depends a lot on how you got your disability. So if your child was injured in a car accident, there's a lot of help available because there's an insurance scheme. But if your child was born with that kind of brain damage, you're really on your own. And so I was interested, having met a number of these families who are quite desperate for some really concrete help, somebody to come in at night and so they can just get a decent night's sleep or look after their child so that they can maybe go off to their other child's ballet recital or something, real, just basic stuff to live a normal life. And I wanted to do 2 things with the book, which was illuminate the plight of those families as we have this debate about whether we need this insurance scheme, and also look at the case of people who claim to be innocent of things that we think they're guilty of.
Part of the book sort of tracks a bit of a shift in disability care. So at the beginning of the book, I think it's Snow, the main character, who talks about retarded children, which is a term that we wouldn't really use today. And then it changes and she starts talking about children who have intellectual challenges, she says. And they bring in these normalisation aids. Now, I'd never heard of that term. I don't even know if it's is that a term for...
Oh, it's quite real. So essentially what has happened in Australia over the past, say, 40 years is that we, like most Western democracies, had institutions where we placed people who had intellectual disabilities, but also people who had a variety of mental illnesses. And for a very long time, there wasn't much that you could do about mental illness. We didn't have the drugs that we have today. For example, a lot of those drugs are quite new. And the treatments were quite barbaric, things like the shock therapy and so on, that are actually coming back into vogue again now, but were sort of out of vogue for a while. And I am very interested in the way we care for people can come in and out of fashion. And so Snow, the main character in the book, when she starts out as a nurse, it's very much in one of those old style institutions. And people talk...
Was that a real place? I mean,
there is indeed
you name a place.
There are indeed real places like Cooloola where intellectually disabled people were kept alongside people who were psychotic. Sometimes in different wards, you would have the insane people in one ward and people with mental retardation in others, but often they would be meshed in together as well. And things like thump therapy are real. That was the idea that some of the male nurses and almost all of the nurses in old-style psychiatric hospitals were men, because the feeling was that you needed to be a big man to sort of keep these quite crazy people under control. That was our idea of care. And this idea, this thump therapy, is a real term which referred to them going around and kind of whacking a patient who wouldn't be quiet at night. That was the way we dealt with things. And of course these things go in and out of fashion. And if you talk to people at the coalface of mental illness now, some of them will tell you that they wish the old institutions were back. Not the barbaric treatment, but they fear that a lot of people who were let out of these institutions under the program of normalisation are now homeless on the streets and, sleeping en masse in the parks, urinating on each other, kicking each other in the head, not taking their drugs as they're meant to, ending up in a psychotic mental illness ward and then being turfed back out again. And they say the institutions were quite good in that respect. So it's interesting to me, as you say, how these things go in and out of fashion.
Like, clearly you show that from institution to community care, but community care still isn't working.
That's right. And a lot of those, for example, the idea was, well, if you had a child or even an adult who had a mental retardation or who was born with some kind of cognitive deformity, then you could release them back into the care of their parents. But often the parents are elderly, so you have like a 45-year-old man who's not capable of living independently, can't cook, can't be left alone with a stove, can't take care of basic things like banking and so on, their own personal needs. And you pop them in the care of their 75-year-old mother who has arthritis and perhaps cancer. And this is meant to be a solution. I mean, to me, it seems absurd. But these are the kinds of stories that you come up against all the time when you're working as a reporter. What do we do? Where is the middle ground? What kind of services should we support?
Do you see a solution or a way that things could be better?
Yes, of course. I mean, to me, there is a middle ground. It doesn't need to be one or the other. In fact, it can be a mix. So there may be a need for institutionalised care for a certain category of patients, and there may be that home-based care is good for other patients, and then you have a mix of care in the middle where you're able to provide people with proper respite. So for example, during the day, their adult child or their teenager, in fact, might be able to go off to some sort of workshop where they're able to learn basic skills and then come home again on a bus at the end of the day and live as part of your family. But again, you still need respite because a lot of parents will tell you that they work during the day, their child is at a school, then their child comes home and they don't really have the opportunity to do basic normal things that you and I would take for granted. So that's what we need to fund, 3 types of care, not one or the other.
One thing that you've said in the past is that through these books, these sort of quite compelling books that you write, readers really enjoy your books. You don't quite have the same relationship with politicians. A lot of them don't like you. Why is that the case?
That's true. And I think that that's true of journalism generally. I mean, I think the difficulty with being a journalist is that you're often, and this may be a nature of the beast kind of thing, that you're often pointing out the failings of various departments, and indeed sometimes of independent or individual politicians, and that's not easy. In the same way that you or I don't like to have our mistakes amplified for everybody to see, I can see why they don't either. And also, I think that they feel that what is the point of raking over a case where, a child has died and it's awful, and they feel like it's really nobody's fault and that child has fallen through the cracks, and what's the point of raking over it, and they sort of see it as a bit sort of sensationalist, whereas journalists will always be on the side of more openness, shine a light on the problems. There's at least the possibility of reform, which there isn't if you kind of sweep it under the carpet. It's difficult to get any kind of working ground, and so there is a bit of antagonism between journalists and politicians anyway, and probably that's not a bad thing.
What do you hope people will get from this book, Sisters of Mercy?
For me, the main thing, I like it when people come back to me and they say, "Oh, well, I couldn't put it down, and I read it in 2 days," and of course I get a sense of pleasure out of that. That's nice to hear. But I just like to slip that little social message in there. I just feel, for me, it's an opportunity to kind of transmit some of the ideas that I get during my journalism.
There are lots of social messages in this book. I mean, which one is the one that you most want to get across?
I'm really passionate about the idea, and I always have been, that we don't do enough for the vulnerable people in the community. And a lot of people who read books, for example, are quite privileged. They're literate, they're somewhat educated, they have often had a career or work of some kind, even if they're retired now, they're enjoying their retirement. They have some leisure time at their disposal. So we're talking about quite privileged people just by the nature of having the time and the ability to read a book puts you in quite a privileged position, and I think we forget that sometimes. And for me, it's always about there is a level of neglect down there, and I want to be part of a community where we're always thinking about lifting. We're always thinking about what can we do about people who perhaps aren't as lucky as us, who don't have the opportunities that we've had. What can we do about that? And that, in this particular book, I'm thinking particularly about parents. I mean, it could happen to any one of us today, tomorrow. You could suddenly find yourself in the position of being a full-time carer for someone, and it would completely turn your life around. If it happens to you as a person whose mother suddenly gets dementia, or if it happens to you because your child is in an accident or your husband has had a stroke and can't work anymore, it could happen to any of us. And can we honestly say that we're providing all of these people with enough support? And I think the answer is no, we're not. We're not providing enough cleaning of their houses, we're not providing them with enough ability to go out and do the shopping, we're not providing them with enough mental and emotional support, we're not doing any of those things. And it's not a bad idea sometimes to say so. Not that we have all the money and all the answers, but just remind ourselves every now and again, not everybody is as lucky as we are.
Yeah. And why Sisters of Mercy? Why the title?
I think it came from two things. Nursing plays a role in the book. I'm in awe of nurses, and I know that nurses are occasionally called Sisters of Mercy, or even Angels of Mercy, which is a similar thing but a different word. And the funny thing is, I had in mind Sisters of Mercy as the title, thinking about nursing and about the work that nurses do, often for too little money and over too long hours. But then I went to this, it was too late to change the title, but I went to a book event, and there was a nurse there, and I was talking about nursing and about the things that nurses do for us, and she said, we don't like to be called Angels of Mercy. And I said, why? And she said, because what we do, isn't it just human? Isn't it just what we as human beings should do for each other? And I thought, she's right, but I still do actually think that they are Angels of Mercy. I do think that they are angels. So even if they don't necessarily like it, that's what I had in mind.
That's a lovely title, and congratulations on your book.
Oh, thank you so much for coming to see me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for speaking to me.